There is a building in Italy that has been falling for over 800 years and still hasn't hit the ground. Engineers have spent decades trying to stop it. Billions of tourists have visited it. And the one question nobody can fully answer is the one that brought you here. When does it finally fall? And here's what makes this stranger than it sounds. At one point, the people trying to save it almost made it worse. They nearly accelerated its collapse by trying to fix it. Keep that in mind. The Leaning Tower of Pisa started construction in 1173. It was supposed to be a bell tower, perfectly straight, purely functional. But within 5 years, something went wrong. The soil on the southern side was too soft, too unstable, and the foundation began to sink unevenly. Construction stopped. Then it started again, then stopped again. It took nearly 200 years to finish, and by the time it was done, the lean was already visible to anyone standing nearby. Here is the part that should make you pause. That delay actually saved the tower. The long breaks in construction allowed the soil to compress and settle. If they had built it straight through without stopping, it likely would have toppled before it was even completed. The thing that looked like failure was the only reason the structure survived long enough to become one of the most recognized buildings on Earth. By the late 20th century, the lean had reached a critical point. The tower was tilting at about 5.5 degrees, which does not sound like much until you realize that anything past 5.44 degrees was considered the threshold of collapse. It was sitting right on the edge, literally. In 1990, Italy closed the tower to the public, not for renovations, for safety. Engineers were genuinely uncertain whether it would survive another decade without intervention. They attached steel cables to the third floor to hold it in place while they figured out what to do. Imagine traveling to Pisa and finding the famous tower wrapped in tension cables like a patient in traction. Then came a near disaster. A team attempted to stabilize the foundation by drilling into the north side and injecting concrete. The plan was to reinforce the base and slow the lean. Instead, the tower lurched. It moved more in a single night than it had in the previous year. Workers felt it shift under them. The operation was immediately halted. That moment in 1995 is the one historians of engineering do not talk about enough, because it revealed something important. The tower is not just a structural problem. It is a dynamic system. The soil, the weight distribution, the lean itself, they're all connected in ways that are not obvious until you disturb them. What eventually worked was far less dramatic. Engineers drilled carefully on the north side and removed small amounts of soil, just enough to coax the tower to tilt back slightly towards center. They did not try to straighten it. They just tried to take some of the pressure off. Over about a decade of slow, careful work, they reduced the lean by about 17 inches. The tower went from 5.5 degrees to approximately 3.97 degrees. That might sound like a small number. It is not. That correction bought the tower an estimated 200 to 300 more years of stability. Engineers now believe it is in better condition than it has been in centuries. So will it fall? The honest answer is yes, eventually. Everything falls. But the more interesting answer is that it is currently safer than at almost any point in the last 500 years. The question shifted from when will it collapse to how long can we keep extending the deadline. And this is where the story changes meaning depending on who you are when you hear it. Most people look at the Leaning Tower of Pisa and see a famous mistake. A crooked building that became famous by accident. Something interesting to photograph. Put on a shirt, hold up with your hands in a tourist photo that looks exactly like every other tourist photo. But what the tower actually represents is something most people only understand once they have had their own version of collapsing ground under them. When the thing you were building started going sideways. When the delay that felt like failure was quietly doing the work that made the whole thing possible. When the intervention that was supposed to help nearly cause the exact disaster it was designed to prevent. The soil in Pisa is called alluvial clay. It is soft, layered, and inconsistent. It does not hold weight the way hard ground does. It shifts. It compresses. It responds to everything built on top of it in ways that are not always predictable until something starts to lean. Most people reading this right now are standing on some version of soft ground, a plan that started sinking before it was finished, a life that did not go straight the way it was supposed to, a schedule that stretched from 5 years to 20 without arriving at anything that looked like the original blueprint. The tower did not become significant because it was perfect. It became significant because the imperfection was visible, because it survived, and because over centuries people kept finding ways to give it more time. Engineers who study the tower say the current stabilization is not permanent. The soil is still moving. The ground beneath Pisa is still slowly changing. They will need to monitor it indefinitely and likely intervene again in the future. There is no final fix. There is only the next intervention that buys more time. Here is what stays with you after you learn all of this. A building that should have fallen 800 years ago is still standing. Not because someone built it right the first time. Not because the ground was solid. Not because the lean was caught early and corrected completely. It is standing because the people responsible for it kept showing up, kept studying it, kept making small adjustments when the situation demanded it, and stopped pretending there was a permanent solution when there wasn't one. The Leaning Tower of Pisa will fall. Eventually. Probably not in your lifetime, and likely not in several lifetimes after yours. But the reason it has lasted this long is not luck, and it is not money, and it is not engineering genius. It is that someone always looked at the lean and said, "Not yet. We can still do something about this. We can still buy it more time." That is the answer to the question you came here with. And if you're honest with yourself, you probably already knew it was about more than a building. There is something else about the tower that the tour guides do not tell you. Something that sits underneath all the engineering reports and the tourist photographs and the careful measurements that scientists have been taking for decades. The lean is the reason anyone cares. Think about that for a moment. If the tower had been built perfectly straight, it would be one of hundreds of medieval bell towers scattered across Italy. Competent. Forgettable. You would not know its name. Your grandmother would not know its name. It would exist in an architecture textbook somewhere between two other buildings nobody visits. The flaw is not incidental to the story. The flaw is the story. Every single person who has ever stood at the base of that tower, craned their neck upward, and felt something shift in their chest was responding to the lean, not the marble, not the columns, not the craftsmanship. The imperfection created the magnetism, and the world figured this out almost immediately. Even before the tower was finished, people were writing about it. They were documenting the lean the way you might document something you know is rare. Something you sense will not last, but want to record while it is still here. There is something deeply human about that impulse. We are drawn to beautiful things that are in the process of failing. We always have been. Galileo allegedly dropped 2 cannonballs from the top of it. Different weights, same drop, to test whether heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. The experiment, whether or not it happened exactly as described, became one of the most famous demonstrations in the history of science. The tower that was a structural embarrassment became a scientific landmark. The mistake that would not stop leaning became the stage for one of history's great moments of discovery. You cannot write that kind of story intentionally. It only happens when something survives long enough for meaning to accumulate around it. Now here is what has been happening underground while all of that history was unfolding above. The foundation of the tower sits on 3 distinct layers of soil. The top layer is mostly sandy silt. The second layer is soft marine clay, which is where the instability comes from. The third layer is dense sand. The tower's weight compresses the second layer unevenly because the soil is not consistent in density across the width of the foundation. The southern side compresses more than the northern side. The tower leans south. Simple in theory, extraordinarily complicated in practice because that second layer is not static. It is alive in the way that geology is alive, moving in timescales we do not naturally perceive, but that instruments can measure down to fractions of a millimeter per year. What the engineers discovered when they began serious monitoring in the 1990s is that the tower was not just leaning. It was also rotating slightly. The entire structure was in a kind of slow spiral. When they removed soil from the north side to reduce the lean, They had to do it in a way that accounted for this rotation, not just the visible tilt. They were not correcting a two-dimensional problem. They were managing a three-dimensional drift that had been accumulating for 8 centuries. This is the kind of complexity that does not show up in the photographs. When you see the tower on a postcard, it looks simple. Cylinder, columns, lean, done. But the reality underneath that image is a structure in constant subtle negotiation with the ground it stands on, and a team of human beings who have been trying to understand and influence that negotiation for decades without fully controlling it. Control, it turns out, was never on the table. The goal was never to stop the movement entirely. The goal was to slow it down enough that the structure remained viable, to keep the conversation going between the tower and the earth beneath it without either one winning definitively. There's a monitoring system installed around the tower now that measures its movement continuously. Sensors embedded in the foundation. GPS satellites tracking the position of the top of the structure to within millimeters. Tilt meters. Groundwater monitors. The tower is one of the most observed buildings in the world, not because of what it is, but because of what it is always in the process of becoming. Engineers review the data regularly. When something shifts, they respond. When conditions change, they adjust the plan. There's a team of people whose professional life is devoted to the ongoing survival of a building that was supposed to be straight and never was. What would it mean to apply that kind of attention to the things in your own life that are leaning? Not to fix them completely, not to make them straight and perfect and finished, but to monitor them honestly, to notice when the drift is accelerating and do something small before it becomes crisis, to accept that the ground beneath certain parts of your life is soft and will always be soft, and that the answer is not to find harder ground, but to learn how to build on what you actually have. Most people do the opposite. They ignore the lean until it becomes undeniable. Then they attempt a dramatic intervention that disturbs the entire system and sometimes makes things worse. The 1995 concrete injection that nearly toppled the tower is not just an engineering cautionary tale. It is a description of what happens when human beings let something go unaddressed for too long, panic, and overreach. Small, consistent, honest adjustments. That is what has kept the tower standing. That is what the data supports. Not a single heroic moment of salvation. Not a complete reconstruction from the ground up. Just people paying attention over a long period of time and making decisions that prioritize survival over perfection. The tower also taught engineers something they did not expect. By studying how the structure had moved over centuries, by analyzing the historical records of its lean and comparing them to what the instruments were showing in real time, they began to understand the soil in ways that no controlled experiment could have produced. The tower's long, troubled existence generated data that changed how engineers think about foundation stability across the entire field. Other buildings in other countries are safer today because one tower in Pisa refused to fall on schedule and forced generations of people to keep studying it. The problem that would not resolve itself became the education. There is a moment every traveler knows, even if they have never been to Pisa. It is the moment when you're standing in front of something that should not still exist, and you feel the weight of all the time it has survived pressing gently against your chest. It happens at old ruins, at ancient bridges, at trees that are somehow still standing after hundreds of years. The feeling is not quite awe and not quite grief. It is something in between, a recognition that time is long and you are briefly inside it, and that the things that last are rarely the things that were supposed to. The Leaning Tower of Pisa should have fallen in the 13th century. It should have fallen in the 15th, the 17th, the 19th. It should have fallen in 1995 when a well-meaning team of engineers drilled in the wrong place at the wrong angle and felt the whole structure lurch toward collapse in the dark. It did not fall, not because it was invincible, because somebody always showed up. And the question that lingers after you learn all of this is not really about the tower. It never was. It is about whatever in your life is currently leaning. Whatever project, relationship, ambition, or version of yourself is tilted further than it should be and moving in a direction you have been quietly hoping someone would notice and correct. The engineers at Pisa will tell you the answer is not a single dramatic fix. It is observation, honesty about what the measurements are actually saying, and the willingness to make a small correction now rather than wait until the only options left are catastrophic. The tower is still standing. It will probably still be standing long after everyone alive today is gone. Not because it was built right, because it was never abandoned.